Hi, class. Today we're going to be discussing the supportive structures of the nervous system, and this will include going through the meninges and the structure of the meninges as well as their function, the ventricular system, its function and structure as well, and the blood supply of the brain. We'll go ahead and finalize with a couple of examples for how this may relate to a clinical situation. I hope also with this lecture to cover how these three different systems help to protect and nourish the central nervous system. Starting off on the meninges, the meningeal layers are composed of three specific layers, and the function of these layers is to provide protection by providing coverage of the brain and the spinal cord. These three layers are made up of the dura mater, which is the outermost layer of the meningeals, which is also the most dense layer, and the dura mater is attached to the inside of the skull. So here I'm showing you an image depicting that layer right here. The one next inwards is the arachnoid mater, and this is the middle layer, which is also the main storage of where cerebrospinal fluid passes through. The third is the pia mater, and that's the inner layer, which adheres to the brain's surface. And this is where is closest to the actual coverage of the brain. You can see that a little bit better here in this blown up version of these three different layers. So we have the dura mater here, the arachnoid, and the pia. And the pia, as you can see, is connected over to the cerebral cortex. The next system is the ventricular system. And the function of the ventricular system is circulation and storage of cerebrospinal fluid. And cerebrospinal fluid functions in providing a cushion for the central nervous system and the surrounding bones, as well as eliminating any waste products within the brain. The ventricular system is made up of three main parts. We have two lateral ventricles, one on each hemisphere, a third ventricle, and a fourth ventricle. So in this image, that's a sagittal view of the brain with the ventricles being overlaid on that brain, or within that brain. You can see where they're placed. There's another image below that, and this is a top-down view looking at the ventricles, and you're able to better see the lateral ventricles that are on each side of the hemispheres, the third ventricle in the middle, and the fourth ventricle extending down. Each of these ventricles have a choroid plexus, which is responsible for producing that cerebrospinal fluid. And next, we'll talk about the blood supply of the brain. And to start, I wanted to orient you to this image first. So what I'm showing you are arteries that highlight the ones that provide blood to the brain in particular. So we have two main systems, two main arterial systems that provide blood to the brain. One is the carotid, and one is vertebral. And the carotid, in particular, are two internal carotid arteries. So this is one internal carotid artery, and this is another. And the vertebral arteries. Again, we have two of them, one over here and one on the other side. And just to note, the internal carotid artery is the one that provides blood to the brain. The external carotid artery provides blood supply to the scalp, face, and the neck. Where the carotid artery meets the blood supply from the vertebral artery is what makes up this area called the circle of Willis, which I'll go ahead and discuss in a little bit more detail in this next slide. The circle of Willis is made up of the branches of the internal carotid artery, as well as communicating arteries. 2 posterior communicating arteries and 1 anterior communicating artery. And here I'm showing you that in green, highlighted in green. So these are the communicating arteries here. And the main branches that come from the internal carotid are the middle cerebral artery. Here we have the anterior cerebral artery and the posterior cerebral artery. So I'm going to go back 1 slide just to orient you to this again. Here's the internal carotid artery connecting or branching off into the middle, the anterior, and the posterior cerebral artery. Now I'll go ahead and talk to you a little bit more about how the branching of the internal carotid artery feeds blood to the different parts of the brain. Each of these arteries connect to different regions of the brain and provide blood to different areas within the brain specifically. So this is a coronal view of the brain depicting just a very basic overview of where the arteries project to. So here we have the anterior cerebral artery, which is more medial, the middle cerebral artery, which is feeding more of the lateral parts of the brain, and the posterior cerebral artery down here. To give you a better picture, the anterior cerebral artery is supplying the medial frontal and medial parietal lobes. So in both of these images that are mid-sagittal views of the brain, we see that the medial frontal and medial parietal lobe is what's highlighted, in addition to the ventral anterior frontal lobe, which is also a part of what receives blood from the anterior cerebral artery. Next, we have the posterior cerebral artery, and the posterior cerebral artery supplies blood to the lower lateral surface of the temporal lobes, the lateral and medial surfaces of the occipital lobes, and parts of the thalamus. And here I'm highlighting that in these 2 pictures as well. Last of the branches from the internal carotid artery is the middle cerebral artery. And this artery is supplying blood to most of the outer or the lateral surface of the cortex, as we mentioned before. And so, as you can also tell, the 2 images that I'm putting up here are different than the last 2, in that they are sagittal views. They're, however, showing you the outer cortex versus the medial side. So it's showing you more of the lateral side of the brain. And particularly provides blood to the lateral frontal, temporal, parietal, and occipital cortex, as well as feeding the perisylvian language zone. The internal capsule and a lot of the basal ganglia also receives blood from the middle cerebral artery. And so oftentimes you'll get clinical cases where an individual has a lot of impairments to the basal ganglia and motor function that's connected to the basal ganglia due to a middle cerebral artery stroke. So here I've shown you an example of a middle cerebral artery infarct. And you can see what it would look like in an MRI image right here. This is the most commonly affected artery. And so oftentimes you'll hear a stroke, and a lot of the time it's the middle cerebral artery affected. This type of a stroke would result in impairments in language processing, planning of movements, as well as speech production. And I want you to just notice that depending on the areas that these different arteries project to or provide blood to, then results in the specific area functioning to be impaired. The next is the posterior cerebral artery stroke as an example. And before I go into detail about this, I want to show you a little bit more about how visual processing usually occurs. So here I'm going to draw a little brain. This is the occipital lobe back here. And what happens is when visual input comes in, the occipital lobe processes it into, it could be divided up into two main pathways. One is identifying where the object is in space, and that is the dorsal stream. The second is taking from the occipital lobe and coming ventrally, and this is the ventral stream. And the ventral stream is responsible for identification of the object, recognition of the object. So what is the object? In a posterior cerebral artery stroke, what happens is the ventral stream is affected, which then leads to the deficit of identifying the object. So an individual would see the object, know where it is in place, in space, but not be able to identify it. And so, as an example, an individual has a cup on the table and can hold on to the cup, but if you ask them, what are you holding, wouldn't be able to tell you what it is that that person's holding. Next, we'll go through the vertebral artery and the branches of that. And I want to first point out to you that the vertebral arteries form the basilar arteries at the level of the pons. So here we have the vertebral artery coming in, forming the basilar arteries here, the basilar arteries. And these are the arteries that then provide blood and supply blood to the brainstem and the cerebellum. So if there was a stroke that involved the vertebral or the basilar arteries, depending on which part of those arteries were affected, it would result in different symptoms. A stroke that would be affecting the brainstem would result in swallowing problems and dysarthria, which is a weakness in the muscles that are used for speech, oftentimes causing a slowed and slurred speech. The stroke affected the cerebellum, there would be problems with coordination and timing and a lot of sequencing that is involved with proper movement and proper motor execution. That's the end of our lecture. I look forward to discussing material that builds on this in the future.